So let's talk more in depth about these types of periodization and how they might apply to bodybuilding. One of the most common forms of periodization is linear. Linear is a basic concept that means that as volume goes down over time, intensity goes up. So earlier in the macro cycle, you'll be doing a greater workload at a lower intensity. This is supposedly going to be useful for building muscular endurance, building hypertrophy, and basically building a base of fitness so that as intensity increases, a greater peak can be reached. As we know, increased cross-sectional area allows for greater force production. So if we can use a linear model to improve hypertrophy, when then the strength training comes, we should have a greater capacity to produce force. However, the traditional linear model did have some issues. Oftentimes, you'd spend months on end in a certain repetition range. So then when you switched, after a few weeks or a few months went by, you'd lose some of the adaptations of the previous cycle. One proposed method to try to avoid this is what's called undulating periodization, where basically, within the microcycle, or from microcycle to microcycle, there would be a broader variety of repetition targets or training goals so that you could train multiple capacities at once. However, it would still follow an overall general linear pattern. As you can see in both of these graphs, volume does start high and then goes down, as does intensity start low and then goes up, even though there is more undulation in the undulating model. So there's still a general linear trend. This is an example of overlapping models and how aspects of one can still improve the other. Now, there's many types of training out there in periodization. Different phases of training will have different focuses, whether that's muscular endurance, whether that's power, whether that's strength or hypertrophy. For the most part, the goals that are relevant to a bodybuilder are hypertrophy, strength, and power. However, what is power? As I said, it's basically speed training with some respect to force. Force times velocity. And it's going to be specific to the sport. Oftentimes, you'll hear of powerlifters doing singles at an 8 RPE, which I'll explain. Basically, heavy technique work. Does that make sense for a bodybuilder? Probably not. However, power days tend to be very excellent for recovery. They're low volume, moderate intensity, and they can be placed between other days to allow for recovery so that when you have a hard session, you're ready to go. Now we're going to discuss this more in future blocks, but keep it in your head that perhaps pure power training for a bodybuilder doesn't make sense, but something else could still fill that role of allowing for active recovery.